Tom, what has he said about the presidency and presidential power and distracting a president? And here, of course, I see you nodding is why I ask. This appointment does not come in the clear. This appointment comes while a case is being litigated on a rolling basis against the president appointing him. It is not in the field of wild speculation that should he make it the day he is sworn in, a case arrives on the doorstep of the Supreme Court involving this president who just appointed him.
That's exactly right, and that may well have played a tie-breaking role. So Brett Kavanaugh worked for Ken Starr, who people will remember from the Clinton investigations, and there was involved in pursuing an investigation of the president. But after that, he wrote a law review article in which he talked about how it is that he thought that those sorts of investigations were too much of a distraction on the president, that the president needed to have his attention focused on his job. And in addition, his rulings on the D.C. Circuit have really favored presidential powers. So I think all of that pointed in the direction of President Trump, if he was concerned about a nominee who would really take his side in those cases, not out of bias, but out of kind of his view of the jurisprudence, he did really well with Brett Kavanaugh.
Since, Tom, thanks to Attorney General Sessions, everyone who watches television news can now recite the definition of the word recusal, wouldn't there be grounds for him to recuse himself from a case having to do with the president who just appointed him to the court?
No, there would be a lot of people who would think that and would be concerned about the appearance of bias. But the rules about recusal in the Supreme Court are very, very, very tough because you can't replace a justice once they step out. So it is actually quite rare for a justice to take themselves out of a case. It's only when they've been personally involved. So, for example, if he had heard a case on the D.C. Circuit, he would be recused in the Supreme Court. But the fact that President Trump nominated him would not lead him to take himself out of any case.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.